Welcome back to the Dementia Collective, the podcast where we explore powerful stories and fresh ideas shaping the future of dementia care. If you're new here, I'm Andrew Carissa, a caregiver, researcher, and founder of BlueBell Village. I created this space because, like many, I've lived the dementia journey firsthand. I know what it's like to feel lost, overwhelmed, and alone, but I also know the strength that comes from connection and working in community to support our loved ones. Each episode, we dive into the people, tools, and innovations that are helping caregivers find their footing and their voice. Our mission? To make dementia care more personal, more connected, and more grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing. Because every caregiver deserves to feel seen, heard, and supported. Today, I'm pleased to have Katie Fyfe join us from across the pond. Katie Fyfe is the founder of elderling.co.uk, an online platform that helps families in the UK better prepare for and navigate the aging parent years. Elderling was born out of Katie's own lived experience caring for her father, who was diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's in 2023. She has been the primary carer since 2021, when she moved him into an apartment next door to him and gave him Dolly, one of her dogs, for companionship. Alongside Elderling, Katie created at Dad and Dolly on Instagram, a space that chronicles her dad's relationship with Dolly and life caring for her dad and their dogs. What began as a personal archive of joyful moments has grown into a community where stories of care, aging, and intergenerational connection are shared openly. Building on that, she is now launching dadanddolly.com, or at Dad and Dolly Project, a British-made clothing project that is inspired by her father's vintage wardrobe, attitude, and life experience, and rooted in values of care, craftsmanship, and sustainability. The project will also support the work of Alzheimer's Society or Alzheimer's Research UK, with a portion of sales donated to the charity. Katie's work sits at the intersection of care, creativity, and community. She's passionate about changing the way society views aging, fostering greater intergenerational connection, and showing that later life can be a time of meaning and contribution when people are supported, engaged, and valued. Before founding Elderling, Katie built a career in global healthcare communications. Her perspective on care and aging was shaped early. As a teenager, she looked after her mother, who had a motor neuron disease, before studying medicine and pharmacology at university. Creativity has always been an important part of her life, and today she draws on all these experiences and her love of design to shape projects that explore aging, care, and connection in new ways. Tanse, Katie, welcome to the Dementia Collective.
Thank you. Very good to be here. Thanks for that introduction. Quite a long one.
You've done a lot of things, and there's a lot that we have to talk about. There's a lot going on in your life, and still going forward, there's a lot.
Hopefully.
So before we start, I typically like to do kind of an origin story. Can you talk to me about growing up, what your life was like? Because it helps us understand how you got into this space and what kind of your headspace was early on towards being a caregiver.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in London. My dad's American, but my mother was English. And I grew up in London, went to an all-girls school, and I was the youngest of four and the only girl. When I was about 16, my mum got diagnosed with motor neuron disease, which is known as ALS in the States and probably Canada too, I don't know. So I then became a caregiver at that age for her whilst I was studying and doing my GCSEs and A-levels, they're called here, but your sort of high school exams. And then I went on to medical school and did 2 years med school. And then in my third year, I decided to switch to do pharmacology and ended up with a pharmacology degree and decided not to pursue medicine. I think there'd been, obviously caring for my mum for that many years and, it'd been quite intense. And I think I needed to get away from medicine for a while and think about whether it was something I wanted to do. And then I went into working in communications in PR, but for healthcare companies, so pharmaceutical companies and non-profits. And I did that for the majority of my career until a few years ago when my dad started showing problems with his memory. And I realized I had to move him in next door to look after him. And then that the sort of type of job I was doing wouldn't be compatible going forward with caring for him as his condition progressed. And I was also at a point when I wanted to do something new as I kind of got into my midlife. And so, yeah, that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
Do you think that your background in medicine and pharmacology set you up to be better able to be a caregiver for your dad?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, I was exposed to care at a young age as well with my mother's condition. And then being a medical student, even though I did the preclinical years, part of that was in a clinical setting in the hospitals. And then my work in working with pharmaceutical companies obviously exposed me to the healthcare industry and patients and various doctors. And I've always had an interest in care, and particularly the care side of healthcare. So that definitely set me up. I think I was always wired that way.
It seems like now you started out trying to go down the prescriptive sort of supports, and now you're on the other side of empowering caregivers themselves and giving them the tools to be successful. So it seems like you're still going down that road, just on the other side of the coin, you know?
Yeah. And I think also, I know when I was doing my clinical attachments in medicine, I used to get very frustrated because I think care is very undervalued and there isn't enough time for it in hospital settings, in care settings. And good care requires a lot of time, a lot of patience, and people just aren't equipped, I don't think, for it, often when it lands in their lap. And, I think I'm not in a position to do physical care for other people apart from my father. So this is a way I can support people to maybe care better or find good care and create environments that support good care, and still be able to care for my dad.
That's the important thing. And I mean, the decision to bring your dad right next door to you, I mean, that's deeply personal, very uncommon from what I hear. Typically, it's they stay where they are, and then at least here in Canada, they stay where they are in some sort of apartment, home, and then you'll commute back and forth. And maybe they'll move into their house, maybe they'll move to facility. That's kind of what we see and what I hear often. So you made the decision that was uncommon, I would say, especially on this side of the pond. So what were you feeling at that point, and how did you decide that was the right choice?
Well, I was very apprehensive, as you can imagine. And, people around me were also a bit apprehensive. Is this a good idea? But I think, it was in while we were still in COVID, and my father had lived with a partner who unfortunately was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and she had to move back to her where she came from, Australia, where her children were and her grandchildren were, so she could be cared for close to them. So he was left in a position where he was going to be on his own and he needed to move. And even though he wanted to stay where he was and he wanted to stay close to where he'd been living, and it wasn't that far away from me, I just knew from having been a carer before and knowing kind of how his age and that, it's not going to get any easier, that actually having him right next door might seem on the surface like it's going to be more of a burden, but I just knew it would actually be less of a burden because I'd be able to make those little adjustments he needed or tasks he needed help with quickly without disrupting my life so much. And he would be, have constant support and companionship. And it would just, ease the time pressure on care more than anything. Because I knew, I'm never going to just leave him on his own. I would always be going back and forth to support him and worrying about him. And I would worry about him less if he was right next door. But it took a bit of persuasion, to get him to move somewhere that he wasn't used to living, even though it was only 15 minutes down the road. But I know, we're both very glad we did it. And I think it would have been a lot harder if we hadn't. And he may even not be doing as well today. In fact, he'd certainly not be doing as well today, I would think.
I'm sure
Not
the
would I.
connection. What's that?
And I don't think I would be doing as well either. I think I would have found it much more stressful.
I'm sure that the connection to have you that close, and if you need something, you can respond, and means a lot to him instead of just being left alone. The isolation would be
Yeah. And I
insurmountable.
think because so much in the early stages of dementia is about like frustrations with little things, and I knew, if he couldn't fix the TV or find his phone, it might take him 3 hours to try and get it fixed or figure out what was going on. And he would, by the end of that 3 hours, would be completely wound up. Whereas I can just fix it in seconds. And then that whole period of 3 hours of frustration and, symptoms coming up is just not something he has to deal with. And I don't have to deal with either. I'd rather deal with it right at the beginning and fix it than 3 hours later when he's very frustrated.
And he still lives next door to you today?
He does, but I now live with him. So I moved in a year ago and rented my flat out because obviously I'm trying to build Eldering and I'm doing this thing with our Instagram account, and I needed to kind of have an income because I wasn't working, doing my old job anymore. And I used my savings up until that point to get things off the ground and cover my expenses. It got to a point where I thought, okay, this is really precarious. So luckily he had a spare room. And I thought, well, and I was there all the time anyway. So it seemed a bit silly to kind of have two flats running when I wasn't even in there really most of the time.
That's fair. And I think the non-tangible benefit is that you're around for him as well. And it's easier, even though it was next door, it's now, he probably sees you more often and continue to build
Yeah.
those relationships, right?
Yeah. I mean, again, it was one of those decisions where I thought, oh gosh, this is, even more enmeshed in each other's lives, but it's turned out fine. I'm someone who's been used to living by myself for quite a long time. So, and I like my own space, but somehow it works. I think having the dogs makes a big difference. They're great stress relievers, dogs.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. They definitely have a way of being cathartic and
Yeah,
peace in chaos, right?
totally.
So, so how did you and your siblings navigate it? If there are multiple siblings that you have, how did you guys all come to the decision together? Or did you come to the decision together that this is what we need to do? Because oftentimes I hear that um, between siblings, there's a lot of dynamics and disagreements on how to make the right choice, and it kind of stalemates people.
I think because my two elder siblings don't live in the UK, they live in Asia, so it's a bit easier to kind of for them to just let me say what needs to be done because they know I'm the closest to him. So it wasn't really too difficult. And also, I think because of the circumstances at the time, having just been still in the pandemic at that point, there really weren't many options. And certainly, he had to move. It made sense he was close to me. And I think it just gave everyone peace of mind that, he would be there. And I guess at that point we weren't sure, how long he'd be there for or what we would do. But for the moment, it was really kind of, there weren't really any other options, particularly as you just didn't know if there was going to be more lockdowns or, what was going to happen. You couldn't want him going somewhere where we wouldn't maybe be able to go and see him or have access to him.
So shifting forward, you gave him Dolly, and then you were living next door to him. Then you created Dad and Dolly for Instagram, right? That's the timeline of how that progressed.
Yeah. So he moved in and then I knew at that time I was still working freelance, but in healthcare comms, which is quite intense and, can be long days. So even though I was there mornings and evenings, he was on his own most of the day. And I didn't like the idea of him being on his own. I just thought that's not going to be good for his mind. So I figured if he had one of my two dogs, Dolly, who they'd already kind of struck up a bit of a bond, that then he would have companionship during the day. You know, I would also, feel better that he's not on his own and he would feel better that he's not on his own. And then his job was to take the dogs out for walks. He doesn't do that by himself anymore. I go with him. But at that point, he was able to. Uh, and then, they just had such a charming relationship. I think because she's this white, fluffy, tiny little Pomeranian with quite a bit of attitude. And my father is this older kind of gentleman who had been in the US Army when he was young. And they just made me giggle. And I was filming them and putting them on my own Instagram. And a friend of mine sort of said, well, why don't you, do a public one? Which I was a bit hesitant about at first. But then I did want to draw more attention to this space of caring and realize that this might be a good way to do it. And my father, agreed with it and was happy for me to do so. So that's how it started.
What was your objective when you were making it right off the bat? If you knew I'm going to make this Instagram page for Dad and Dolly, what were you hoping to achieve in creating it?
think I think it just, for me, I like to be able to show the benefits of companionship for older people because I've always believed strongly in that. I've always been really quite upset about seeing older people isolated when they really need companionship more than ever, really. And I'm a great believer in the huge benefits, whether it's a canine companion or human companionship, just companionship in general and connection makes such a difference in all of our lives, but particularly when you're older and you're having memory issues like my dad. And I think there's a lot of baggage around the word care and around dementia, particularly in the UK. And it's kind of got connotations with things that perhaps people don't really want to engage with. And I knew that my dad and the dog and that relationship and our bond was a good way to get people to see it in a different light, and to see, how you can do if you are kept engaged and you have got support and companionship. So that's really kind of how it started and why it started. I wanted people to kind of see this life stage and have more visibility around it, because for me, it's just so important that people know that this happens, that you do end up having to sometimes care for elder parents and relatives. And it doesn't have to be something that you put your neck or put your head in the sand about until it actually happens.
Did you expect that it was going to grow as much as it has?
No, I think I thought I might get, maybe if I was lucky, 10,000 followers. That was like my goal. It's because I thought that would be good enough. But yeah, and I certainly didn't expect people were going to be so enamored with my dad's style and outfits. I think because it's my father. And so you just are so used to your parents, you don't always look at them that way. And that was just his clothes. And I think that was really sort of like, actually, yeah, he does have quite cool clothes. I'd never really thought about this before. So that was interesting. And also just the amount of messages that people shared about their own experiences with parents who had Alzheimer's, or grandparents or partners, and, either people who had gone through it and, that their loved ones had already died, or who were going through it at the moment. So that was interesting, actually, and quite moving.
Do you have any particular stories that stick with you for how people have responded or reached out or reacted to Dad and Dolly?
There's so many. I mean, I spend a lot of time replying to DMs, and I'm so, some people go, oh, it takes up a lot of time. You should do it. I'm like, well, if they're just putting a heart, then no, maybe not. But if they're writing something about what it's meant for them to see my dad or see someone being cared for, then, I just can't let it sit there and not be answered. But I think one of the ones that's happened more recently that I was really pleased about was a lady who lives by herself, who's older, in America. And she was saying she didn't have much appetite, and she always was interested to see the food that I make for my dad, because I cook for him, obviously. And I'd suggested to her, well, the reason and she was very surprised that he has an appetite, and because a lot of older people lose it. And I said, well, I think it's because it's someone making it for him and making it with love. And, it's kind of, food is about the way it's presented and who's made it and why they've made it. And it's very different when you live on your own. You've got to cook for yourself. You do go off your food. I think a lot of people do. And so I said, why don't you go and, find someone, a local chef school or something. Maybe there's a student that can come and cook for you, once a week. And she went and did it, and she's found someone, and she's really delighted, and she's sending me photos of the food that's being made for her. And that really made me happy, because her father had also had Alzheimer's, and she'd gone through a difficult time with family. And it's just, yeah, I was really happy to see that, seeing me care for my dad and my dad eat has encouraged someone else who's older to find a way to care for herself, you know, through what we're doing. So that was lovely.
Does your dad recognize how big Dad and Dolly is?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, he kind of, it's not in front of him all the time. I mean, he never looked at Facebook or Instagram. He never got into that. And so, when I bring it to his attention, he remembers, but it might take him a second, like, oh, yeah, 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 that thing. But I think for his generation's concept and for his particular character, even before he had Alzheimer's, the concept of like followers around the world of pictures of him and videos just seems kind of bizarre to him. And, I said to him the other day that, oh, someone's written here, like, if you looked up cool in the dictionary, there should be a picture of your dad and the two dogs. He was like, what? Which I just think is great. I mean, an 89-year-old man with a dementia is the epitome of cool. So I think that's fabulous. But, he's just not the sort of person that would ever have put himself on Instagram or talked about his clothes or, he's just my dad. He likes to make his porridge and watch the TV and do what he does and hang out with the dogs. So, but yeah, I mean, we see people in the street who recognize him and he finds it very charming. And I think it gives him a real boost, actually.
So, what things are you doing to keep your dad mentally strong? He's 89 and it's been probably 2.5, almost 3 years, I would suspect, based on the numbers you said earlier, since he got diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's. So, what are you doing to keep him moving forward, mentally strong, um, retaining as much of his memory and cognition as he can? What sort of activities, practices, those sort of things are you up to?
Well, so the dogs, I think, are good at helping him stay strong, coming on the walks every day in the morning and at lunchtime and in the evenings. We walk together with the dogs. I make sure he does exercise. So I have a woman who comes around who's a carer, but also used to be a personal trainer, and she specializes in exercise for older people. And so she comes every other week for 3 days for a few hours each day and does exercises with him to keep him mobile. And a lot of it is coordination and things like that. And that I think helps a lot. Just a very good, nutritious diet. And she does Scrabble with him too sometimes. I think the thing with the mind sort of games to keep your brain stimulated, she tried chess for a bit and I'm like, that's never going to work. He was never interested in chess. And even I would struggle with chess. But Scrabble is okay. He can manage that. And just sort of talking about things that are relative to his era. So a lot of reminiscence therapy. We go through old photos. I ask him a lot of questions about my ancestors and his time growing up. And yeah, and then we have a good routine, which helps keep him strong. I think he's mentally strong. But I also add novelty into that. So, we go out places and mix it up sometimes, but without too much. It has to be somewhere that's not going to completely overstimulate him and overwhelm him. And then obviously working together on this clothing project has been really good for his mind, I think, and mine. So he's learning at the same time as I am. He's meeting new people. I took him to a factory in North London where they make jeans the old way, like the old West way, but even better, actually, almost like tailored. And he was fascinated and, totally engaged. So yeah, I think it's doing things like that and keeping the variety and letting him continue to do the things he knows how to do. So he always does the washing up. He hangs out washing. He makes his own porridge. He needs some help, like some prompting, but I let him get on with it, even if it's getting slower and slower. But it's important he still does that and I don't take over from him.
You've talked about community, creativity, and quality connection. Can you share how those elements show up day to day or how they impact your dad?
Yeah, I mean, for community, we go to the same coffee shop every morning and there's people from our neighborhood. I mean, we're lucky to live in London where there's a lot of mix of people, whether residents, office workers, all sorts of people. And we have our coffee. It's a ritual, but he meets and chats to people from around the neighborhood. And then we go to neighbors for our movie night every other week, which again is a connection into the community and a way for us to not be isolated with dementia, which can happen, I think, because people don't know how to talk to people with dementia, or they start backing away a bit. And it's important for me to have that community for him and for me. And then we have the community with this clothing business we're doing, meeting people that we're working with. So we're making everything in the UK. One of the reasons we're doing that is a quality reason, but also because it means Dad and I can go to the factories and workshops, meet the makers, be immersed in it. And then what were the other ones? It's community connection and quality connection.
Yep.
So quality connection for me is, ensuring that those conversations are quality, and what we're doing together is something that's quality, not just a fleeting moment. So, talking to him about things that he can talk about. I think sometimes, if I you go to somewhere where there's lots of people around, but he can't engage in the conversation because it's going too quickly for him and he can't follow it. That's not connection to me. It's not quality connection. Quality connection is, getting to a point where he then is able to flow with conversation and, connect. And also, I think for me, this time with my dad has enabled me to connect more with him, which then enables me to be a better carer because I know what he likes, how he likes it. And I have a kind of connection to him in the same way I had with my mum, because with ALS, towards the end of the disease, you can't talk. So I needed to have a strong connection to her to know what she wanted, even though she couldn't say it. And I think with dementia, that's important too, because there may come a point when my dad won't be able to verbalize what he wants and needs. But because I've worked on that strong connection and bond, I hope I will intuitively know what it is, or it won't take me long to figure out how to kind of make sure that his needs are met.
So your dad was in the U.S. Army. I'm not familiar with all the nuances of American military supports, but they have Veterans Affairs and VA, and I guess, yeah, does he get supports by extension being in London because he served in the army, or is there any sort of supports available to him because of his work doing that?
If there are, I'm not aware of them, and maybe I should look into that. I mean, I think in the US, when people live in the US, they're more tapped into that. I don't know if it extends here. I mean, he went to West Point, which is the big military academy in the US, and then he was in the army after that for 4 years. And before West Point, he was in the reserves for a couple of years. But he never went to war, luckily for him. And then he left the army after serving for 4 years as an officer. But as far as I'm aware, I don't think he has anything, but maybe I should look into that. So thank you for bringing it up. I never thought about that. There's just so many things. There's so much paperwork there, with all this sort of stuff, and with a business too. Sometimes that just slipped. I just never even thought that might be something.
I'm sure being on the other side of the pond, there's probably a few more logistical hurdles to try and navigate.
Yeah.
I don't know if they have dementia supports through the VA. I don't know, but I was just wondering that. I know on the Daddy and Dolly website, there's a really good photo of actually your dad from, I suspect it's at West Point in his military uniform.
Yes. Yep. Which we still have. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about discovering his wardrobe through, everyone bringing it to my attention on Instagram is, looking at all these things he's kept over the years. And, some of them are just civilian clothes he's bought in his life and held on to, and they've had meaning. But then he's so proud of having gone there, I think, because he was the first in his family to go to college. And, he didn't even graduate high school. He had to go back in order to go in. And there's a long story to how he got into West Point and how he managed to stay there, through quite a lot of struggle and endurance. So finding, I can see why he's hung on to them and why they mean something to him. And they now mean a lot more to me because I've been able to have conversations about them with him. And, that's been really interesting for me. Getting to know my dad as a person versus just my dad.
How did your dad's wardrobe and personality inspire you to create this fashion line, let's call it, to support? I don't know the proper word to be, let's call it fashion line, social enterprise.
We call it just clothing because we're not really fashion, because we're not. I think fashion has got a bit of a a bad rap these days because there's so much fast fashion and fleeting trends, and this is really about quality clothing with meaning. So how did it inspire me? Did you want to
Yeah.
know?
So how did your dad's wardrobe specifically lead to that decision to create it and then to say that we're going to support Alzheimer's research as a result of it?
Well, I think it was brought to my attention through Dad and Dolly. And then, as I say, I took more of an interest in the clothing and, the fact that he'd looked after it so well, and that, how different the way people bought clothes was compared to the way perhaps people buy them now, and how well differently they were made compared to how they were made now. And I think kind of at one point I'd discovered this T-shirt which he'd held onto from West Point, which is now 70 years old. And I think that was the point where I thought, this is just such a symbol of endurance to me, this T-shirt. It's just like he's held on to it, and it means something. And I also just think T-shirts are such unifiers. Like, everyone wears a T-shirt. It doesn't matter if you're young or old. And even that style of T-shirt and T-shirts themselves were kind of born in that era. People didn't really wear them out and about as they do today. And that's because of my dad's generation and, them bringing that and jeans and things like that into mainstream fashion, and that they've endured as well. So that T-shirt was really when I thought, that's something we could do. It's not a tricky thing to do. And it's a great way to kind of, I think, get a message out there. T-shirts have always been used to get messages out there, or to kind of show your solidarity with something, whether it's a cause or a band or something like that. So I thought, let's do something with this that helps shine a bit of more of a light on, care and connection and older people and the value that they bring to society, which is just something I don't know, I had such a sort of itch to scratch to get people to see, you know, the value in care and the value in older people and the value of spending time with older people. So that's how it was born. And then through this time with my dad and Alzheimer's, I've kind of come to realize, the importance of taking time to care and to slow down and to think about things and do things with more of a conscience. So I wanted to do it, as I say, as ethically as I could, using, good quality organic cottons and working with local people, and both because it meant my dad and I could be more immersed and meet people and understand how this is or works, but also just from an environmental standpoint and quality standpoint. So yeah, it's pretty much how it came together. And just, my realization that clothing holds memories, and Alzheimer's is all about losing your memory. And, I think the disconnection between older generations and younger generations is a way of losing memories for everyone, because you can't pass down the memories to the younger generation and the experience and what you've learned. So it was just a kind of, I don't know, it was like a sort of creative explosion in my body. I was like, oh my God, I want to do this, And I used to be a very creative kid. I was really into art and music, and then I kind of veered into science and medicine. And this has been a wonderful return to myself and that part of me, which Dad has enabled, which is, for me, I think, again, amazing. It just shows time spent with an older person can bring stuff out of you didn't even know was there. Um,
Are you planning on selling them internationally? So if some people in Canada want to purchase it, are they going to be able to purchase this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, there's sort of import taxes and things involved, but there would be nothing from stopping us selling it internationally, because we're selling online. And yeah, I would definitely sell them to anyone that wanted one in Canada. As
So
far as
you said that care and craft are parallel processes. Can
mm,
you talk about this? What do you mean by that?
I think because care is about a lot of consideration and thinking beyond yourself, and you have to understand the subject or the object in order to do it well. And craft, and you have to take time to do it, and it requires patience and thought. And craft is the same, and they're both foundations for society. I think, making is so important for humans. And there's actually something I wanted to watch on television about how the act of making is what's helped humans evolve and for our brains to do what they can do. Um, I just feel that, for craft is a very foundational part of society. You need craftsmen in order for societies to thrive and for us to thrive. When you engage in a craft, you thrive in the same way that, with care, you can't have a society unless people care, and care well. And in order to do both, you need time, you need patience, you need consideration. Yeah, I guess that's for me the kind of two parallels. And you also need creativity. I think care requires you to think creatively, particularly with dementia when things suddenly change and, you have to suddenly think, okay, how can I communicate with this person, or what can I do? And sometimes you have to get really creative to get into the mind of the other person and to work out what's going to calm them down, or what's going to help them feel calm and happy. So yeah, I guess I just see the two have a lot of similarities.
Do you feel like society as a whole really understands the weight of what caregiving is and being a family caregiver?
No, not at all. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to change. I think it's very hard to make care visible because so much of it also goes on in your head. It's not just the physical getting someone out of bed and helping them get dressed, if that's part of care. And also, a lot of people think of care as being just that, you know, and once that person's ready, that they just sit there. And actually, care is a lot more than that. And it occupies a huge amount of space in your head because you're constantly thinking about someone else, not just yourself. And it happens behind closed doors. People don't talk about it. It's just, historically undervalued and under funded. And I think it needs a lot more recognition because without it, you don't have a society. It really is. You don't have children thriving and you have older people, neglected if there's no care, and particularly good care, and that is a skill. I think it's not seen as a skill. And for me, I think it's a skill. It's one that I'm lucky to have honed as a young person and, perhaps been more naturally attuned to. But yeah, I see it as a skill that should be much more broadly recognized before, you know, sooner rather than later, because I think society is suffering at the moment. Perhaps that's a lot to do with the fact that there's not enough care.
What would you say the hardest part of this journey as a caregiver has been for you?
I think the uncertainty of not knowing, when the care is going to end or what's going to happen, because it's hard to plan, and also kind of trying to carve out time for myself, especially with dementia, because you kind of want to spend as much time with the person while they're still as well as they are. And that means I can sometimes neglect myself. So I have to take more consideration for that. So that's been hard. And I think, not seeing my friends as much as I used to, living with, just constant uncertainty has been really difficult, particularly with, starting a business too. The two together are both very unpredictable and uncertain, and that's a lot to stomach. So I'd say that's the hardest part. The care itself, you know, being with my dad, looking after him, cooking for him, making sure he's okay, that I don't find as difficult. And I think that's obviously because we have a good bond, but it's the other parts, and it's the trying to get help and support and feeling isolated and just sometimes needing a break and not ever being able to take it.
How do you reconcile your own identity? Because oftentimes caregivers go and say, I fully immerse myself into being the caregiver and I lose who I am because I'm so focused on what they need. How do you navigate that?
With difficulty, as most people do, I think I have to consciously make time for myself, me. And I think doing the business has been or this project particularly has been a good way for me to not lose my identity, um, and have something to look forward to and to feel like I'm moving in a direction for myself, even though it involves my dad and it's to do with what this situation is, it's still me, and particularly, doing design, something I've always wanted to do and just never had the courage or time. So, using this time caring for dad to make sure that I'm still nourishing myself with something that means something to me and is very much me is really the way I'm getting through it, I'd say. But it's hard, I think especially when you really love the person that you care for, to extract yourself and, take time for yourself and not lose your identity. But I think it's the same with a lot of people when they're parents, or single mums, when they're looking after a child, and it's hard to kind of separate the mother and the woman that came before and keep that essence of yourself as well as being the other role.
So how did Elderling get created? Because that would have been after Dad and Dolly, right?
So Eldering started just before Dad and Dolly. Well, it started after I moved Dad in and had started filming him and Dolly, basically for myself and for my family and friends. And then Eldering sort of came about just about the same time, mostly because I just realized that, we're all so unprepared for this life stage and nobody talks about it. And when you come into it, you often come into it in a crisis point. And then you realize, oh, we need all this legal documentation, or where's the will, or how do I navigate the healthcare system, or like what health symptoms do I need to be looking out for in later life, and all these different things that suddenly you're confronted with. And I guess I always thought it's a bit, I don't have children, but I figured it's like having a baby and not having any NCT classes or any education before you suddenly have a child. And then you've got to work out, oh, I need to get a pram, or, oh, I need to, and it's tricky because you don't have, you have a good 9-month warning with a child. So, this is the time. Whereas, with this, sometimes some people, there isn't really too much to do because, the circumstances are perhaps a parent dies suddenly when they're younger. But then, if you've got a parent who's growing older and a health crisis happens, you really, are in trouble when you don't have a lot of this stuff prepared and if you don't know where to find it. And I realized I spent a lot of time trying to find information that I could rely on, and resources and people that could help me, and products. And it would go from one site to another, and none of them were sort of specialized to my particular need. So I wanted to create something to help other people like me, to make it just a bit easier and to help people start talking about it earlier, and maybe kind of put things in place that can make this life stage a little bit less stressful and have a bit more control. I don't think you can ever really be in control because it's just so unpredictable, but there are things that can make it much less stressful if they're sort of done ahead of time. But the tricky thing is people having the conversation. So, and kind of acknowledging end of life as a reality. So yeah, that's what made me want to do it.
Elderling was really based upon your experience and what you needed. So you created it as a way to help other people avoid the struggles you went through then?
Yes, and also just because I realized it wasn't just me, other people I was talking to had exactly the same issue and were coming to me for advice. So, as their sensible friend with some history of some background in medicine. So, yeah, I think I just felt this was just a massive gap. And not only did it affect mostly women like me in midlife, because we tend to be the primary caretakers in these situations, but also the older people who maybe don't get the care early enough that could have made their end of life more supported and better. And so they have a better quality of life. So it was to kind of help both groups really, to make sure, you know, people in midlife, when this normally happens and they're balancing a career and their kids and very stressed and often end up leaving their work altogether because of that stress, to help them manage their way through it, and also to make sure their parents and relatives get better care and support and products that can help them earlier.
And I would suspect that if the UK health system is anything like Canada's, it's very complicated. There's lots of moving pieces, and trying to figure out where do I need to go, how do I need to go, how do I need to navigate it is a nearly a full-time job for most people.
Yep. And I mean, I don't think I'm going to be able to solve that, unfortunately. But I think, there are a lot of people who've gone through this who have a lot of knowledge. And I mean, I spoke to someone today who I know through Dad and Dolly who's gone through something like this with her mother for years and feels the same. I feel like I want to tell all these people all these little hacks and things that you should know. So, because it is so complicated, and even for the doctors and nurses, it's complicated. It's just got so big and so difficult. And, but, there are little things you can do that make it easier. And there are things that each of us knows that can help you kind of navigate the system a bit more easily. But it is difficult. But I hope that by doing this too, maybe eventually, some government institutions might be interested to hear from me and other people who've gone through this and can maybe try and help shape things so that they are less difficult to navigate. But I think that's a bit longer down the line. I don't sure I've got room for that at the moment in my schedule.
Maybe not room, but you definitely have the platform to be a voice in that advocacy space.
I hope so. At some point, maybe.
So if you could reimagine how society supports caregivers and older adults, what would you change?
Gosh, I think it's difficult because society is very focused on productivity and not so much on people. So caregivers, care and looking after older people is not something that I associate with productivity. Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I think recognition to start with is important. Valuing older people, and just because someone's ill or old and perhaps has illness, it doesn't mean that there aren't ways they can contribute in some way that gives them a sense of purpose and meaning. And, I guess carers need financial support to do what they do. They need, particularly when people come out, leave work in order to care as family caregivers. And then at the end of it, find they're no longer carers. So that's a huge part of their identity for several years normally. And then suddenly they've lost the person they're caring for. They've then lost what they're doing every day because they were caring. And they don't know how to maybe move on and what happens next, and how do you get back into the workplace if that's what you want to do. So I think there needs to be a lot more support for people in managing that time and that transition and being able to understand what those skills are that you've acquired through care and how they can be translated into other jobs, which I think they can. And yeah, I think, and I think also a lot of time people feel like the way to help a carer is to outsource that care to someone else or like stop them from having to care. And actually, I'm quite happy to care for my dad. I do need breaks and I need support, but that doesn't mean I want to completely outsource my dad's care. He's not a problem I need to deal with. He's a person I need to care for, and I need care for myself too. And actually, I had a friend once that did something wonderful for me once, because oftentimes people want to help and they don't know how. And she just ordered a sort of private chef to cook some food for me and deliver it, so I didn't have to cook all weekend. And it was all homemade, lovely food, like spaghetti bolognese. I mean, nothing it wasn't exactly, it's not fancy things, but it really meant something to me that I was being cooked for by someone else and cared for. You know, I think that's one of the hardest things, is just feeling invisible and like no one can see all the work that you're doing. And so being seen, even just being seen, makes such a big difference. And being valued and being told, thank goodness that you're doing this, and, getting some food from time to time so you don't have to cook is good.
Oh yeah, a good home cooked meal that you don't have to cook.
Yeah, and
It
also
definitely
just
helps.
made by someone else, not Deliveroo, not a kind of takeaway or something that's already pre-packed from the supermarket. It's made by someone else who's taken the time to order it and send it to you. That's what matters. It's someone else taking time for you, because you take so much time for everyone else, you know?
So if folks have listened to us talk here for about an hour, what are some things that you really want them to take away after hearing your story?
I guess I want them to connect more with people in real life, particularly older people, to make sure, time is fleeting, and we all rush around a lot nowadays. But actually, I found taking time has been one of the biggest positives for me with this, and taking time with my dad, taking time with the business, not rushing it, and how much richer our lives can be when we do connect with older people and slow down a little bit. I mean, you can't always slow down, but it's moments when you can. Um, I think there's a lot of reward that comes from that and from caring. And also, you know, caring can be a lot better if you really lean into it and if you get creative. So I think had I tried to kind of keep my old life and sort of, you know, look after my dad, but very sort of light touch and try not to let my life get disturbed or derailed, I would have found it a lot more stressful and he would have found it a lot more stressful. But by kind of, you know, going with the wave and finding opportunities within it, and, you know, I've actually been able to make this situation far less stressful and for something to grow from it. So I would say, look for those things when you're caring, try not to look at it as a burden on your life, even if it can be. I'm not saying it isn't. At times I would like to just go out and do something and I can't. But if I try not to focus on that bit, and I try to focus on what can this life stage do that's positive for me and maybe others around me and for my dad, and, get creative, I suppose. That would be my message.
Wow, and I hope that this conversation was impactful to people. I know that you've definitely been doing so many remarkable things. You're doing so much good and bringing light to elders, and that we don't have to have a stigma around dementia. So I'm so thankful that you've came to talk to us today. So that's it for today's episode of the Dementia Collective. A heartfelt thank you to you, Katie Fyfe, for showing us what care can look like when it's rooted in love, creativity, and presence. Your journey with your dad and Dolly is a reminder that small choices can build an entirely new way of living. If you want to follow their story, head over to Instagram and check out at Dad and Dolly, or explore our new clothing line and community at dadanddolly.com. Supporting aging parents, check out elderling.co.uk for tools, insights, and solidarity. If you're walking the dementia journey yourself, we see you. You're not alone. Whether you're just starting out or in the day-to-day, we're here to help. Visit us at BlueBell to learn more or reach out directly. Until next time, remember, you're seen, you're strong, and you're doing something that matters more than you know. Until next time.